Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. What would happen if you were to stop on the street and ask 10 people who started Christianity? You'd probably hear people give you the same quick response, Jesus. But those 10 people would be wrong. Jesus wasn't a Christian. Jesus lived and died as a Jew. Understand the Jewishness of Jesus is the secret to knowing Him better and understanding His message in the 21st century. Walking through Jesus' life from birth to death, Rabbi Evan Moffic serves as a tour guide to give Christians a new way to look at familiar teachings and practices that are rooted in the Jewish faith and can illuminate our lives today. Among the critically acclaimed highlights of this book, Rabbi Moffett gives fresh insight on how Jesus' contemporaries understood Him, explores how Jesus' Jewishness shaped Him, offers a compelling new perspective on the Lord's Prayer that will forever change the way you experience these powerful words. It provides renewed appreciation for Jesus' miracles. Rabbi Evan Moffic belongs to a new generation of rabbis opening up Judaism to people of all faiths. With Rabbi Moffic, you'll find an accessible guide to ancient Jewish wisdom for a happier, healthier life. He was described as the Chicago Tribune as the rabbi we'd love to call our own, wise and kind, humble and good beyond words. A graduate of Stanford University, Rabbi Evan Moffic was ordained in 2006, and in 2009 he became the youngest senior rabbi of a large synagogue. He continues to lead Congregation Solel, a 500 family and growing synagogue in the Chicago suburbs. He speaks frequently at conferences, companies, and houses of worship across the country. His latest book is on the resurgence of anti-Semitism across the world and was covered here on this program last month. But I asked Rabbi Evan Moffett to come back to talk about his book, What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Jewishness of Jesus. So I'm very happy to introduce you to my friend, Rabbi Evan Moffic. Rabbi Evan,
it's wonderful
welcome.
To be back.
Welcome. It's so great to have you back. You are kindred spirit, an old friend, wise counsel, and someone who was provoked by a statement, a conversation that you had that provoked you to literally thousands of hours of research. And I commend you for wanting to dig into where I struggled in my 40 years of studying, and I talked with you about the rabbis that I sat under and studied under, when I finally took the 4 years out to do my own research and to examine the scriptures and to make my own decision. But I was born a Jew, I was raised a Jew, I live as a Jew, I'll die as a Jew. And regardless of whether or not you and I agree who the Messiah is or will be, we're both Jewish.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And all the writers of the New Testament were Jewish, and
Yes.
they remained Jewish.
Yes. Yes.
There was no conversion. As a matter of fact, it's startling to me that people ask me, when did I convert? And I would say, what would I convert to?
That's right. That's right. Well, I think your story and the way you just explained it actually illustrates something new. And it's partially a function of time. I mean, it's new and it's old. Because as you were growing up, you probably knew that for many Jews, Jesus was almost a dirty word. You didn't, and there are still rabbis like that. There was an Orthodox rabbi who came to a talk I gave, and we had a wonderful conversation afterwards. But he wouldn't say the name Jesus; he would only say J. And and I understand where that came from. I think it came from this history of anti-Semitism. I mean, many rabbis you studied under, they grew up in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, where so many Jews were lost. And in many ways, the Holocaust, while Adolf Hitler was not a Christian, he despised religion generally, it came out of Christian Europe. And so there were many people who associated Jesus and Christianity with anti-Semitism. as relations have improved between Jews and Christians, we can talk about things, we can open doors that have never really been locked, but were never really opened before. And I think we're in that era now, and I'm grateful for that.
And I'm grateful for that. And I have such respect for you and such admiration for you. And I'm honored. I think that the connection you and I made in our first interview talking about anti-Semitism, and it was almost a prophetic encounter, because in the next 30 days after that interview, we saw rampant anti-Semitic statements being made by Congress people. We saw rampant anti-Semitic statements being made in your city by Louis Farrakhan, that this hate speak is the only hate speak that's okay.
It's astounding. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, in that I think the same kind of anti-religion trend that you see among the progressive left, a real despising of any kind of religion. I mean, we saw that with Mike Pence's wife. People were so angry that she was teaching at a Christian school. This antipathy towards religion goes hand in hand with the rise in anti-Semitism, because in many ways, Jews represent God's voice, God's people. They're the original chosen people. And when people get angry at God, people get angry at the Jews. And the same people that hate God also hate the Jews. And I think we're seeing that grow more and more, and even over the last month.
What's so amazing is that if you're anti-Jewish, you are anti-Jesus.
Yes, without question.
It goes one and the same. And from a covenant perspective, and you and I understand this as the Brit, the covenant, the cutting of a deal. There are, all the way through Jeremiah, there's the discussion of covenants. There's the Edenic covenant, the Adamic covenant. There's the covenant with Noah, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with David. And then God says, I'm going to bring a new covenant. And this is what the Christians will look at and say, this is the new covenant in Jesus, okay? There are lots of debates and lots of discussion about what God was saying, about tablets of stone writing it on our heart. They would equate that to the Acts chapter 2, the pouring out of the Spirit of the Ruach HaKodesh. But you and I look at that scenario, tongues of fire, rumblings, a shofar blast. Well, that was Mount Sinai. That was the exact event described in the same words as the thunder and the fire and the rumblings and the writing on tablets of stone. Now he's going to write it the law. Well, right. What law is there but the Mosaic law? He's not saying I'm going to write a new law. He doesn't say in Jeremiah 31, I'm going to write a new law. Right. He says, I'm going to write my laws on their hearts, on their minds, and it will be in their hearts, and that no longer will a man need to teach his brother to know the Lord, because they will all know me. And so then we have this going off tangentially, and all of a sudden we have this Christianity, which is birthed out of really the Roman Catholic diametric shift. Was the geopolitical contextual threat of a non-conforming people who had been a non-conforming people since Lech Lecha, since leave your home and leave your family. That's the origin of it, of a people set apart. And so it became threatening. So Constantine comes along, and we have great rich history, but it's geopolitical history that says, I'm going to break the backs of the people that will not yield under the yoke of oppression of Rome. And I'm going to do everything that's not Jewish, and I'm going to make them conform to everything that's not Jewish. But what's comical to me is I've been in Catholic churches. They look like the synagogue. They have a bima, They have incense, they have a laver bowl, they have a lampstand, the Pope wears a kippah. How much more Jewish do you get than all the articles of the temple?
That's
so
right.
the more they try to be different, the more they become the same.
Interesting. Well, yeah, Martin Luther thought the Catholic Church was too Jewish. That was part of his critique of the Catholic Church. But because monotheism is rooted in Judaism, and I think that's what you pointed out, and we're kind of bringing that really up into the forefront again.
It's interesting because there's only two people in the Bible: Jews and Gentiles.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That's it. That's all there is. Ethnos was something that we would look at racism, ethnic, was introduced by the Greeks. Adonis was the prime example of ethnos, of creating the perfect person. This was a non-biblical concept and has no place in a biblical understanding. So neither Torah, nor the writings, nor the prophets, nor any of the Brit Hadashah or the New Testament writings have anything to do with people of color, of people of national origin. We look at the Moabites, we look at the Hittites, we look at the Amorites, we look at the parasites, the termites, the pesticides. I mean, we look at all the ites. And what's interesting is if we look at the origin of all of it, it begins in Genesis 3:15, and we're introduced to a seed of a woman. And everything God does is to protect the seed line of this woman. Now, we see that seed as going from Eve to Isaac, from Isaac to Jacob, and then from Jacob on forward through the 12 tribes of Israel, through the reduction of our population to 70. Well, I was going to make this point to you. I was actually going to call you the other day. I said, and I wanted to ask you, do you remember when there was a big controversy over the speckled newt? And there was, up in the upper Midwest, they were going to put a dam or a factory, and they said that, no, it's going to disrupt the habitat of an almost extinct group of newts, the speckled newt, or the yellow-bellied speckled newt. Yeah. And I thought, well, okay, well, that's kind of interesting, because where was the uproar when there was only 71 Jews left on the face of the earth?
Yeah, yeah.
We were down to 71. We have a number. Okay?
Yeah, in the Bible. Yep.
That's not even a big family.
No.
That was how close to extinction we were.
That's right. Right. I mean, the survival of the Jewish people. I often talk about this with, as a rabbi, I have people who come to me and they are doubting God's existence, people questioning, where do we go? Why is there suffering in the world? How do I know God exists? And one of the things I often talk about is the survival of the Jewish people, I think, is evidence for God's presence in the world. They're down to 71. They're 1/3 of our people were destroyed in this last century. And yet, through empires, Jews are about 0.02% of the world population. And yet we survive as a people. It's truly miraculous. And if history was just a random and there was no God, Jews would have been destroyed thousands of years ago. And I think their survival is evidence that there is something powerful in the universe that we have to become attuned to.
Well, I agree with you. I want to go back because we're talking about this book that it's been out for a while, but I felt it was so profound that you were so provoked by a conversation with a young lady that this really got you in the kishkas. People not knowing kishkas, your gut, you're right there in the belly. That it brought you real trouble in your spirit, real conflict from a spiritual wrestling, almost a Jacobian experience within you that says, if I don't clear this up, There are going to be people who are walking around with a cloud over their head in complete misunderstanding of the foundation of their own faith.
Yes.
And there are cornerstones that must be set in place that are immovable, unshakable, of which all of Christianity is built upon, and it's not taught in the church.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, a lot of fellow Jews, rabbis, have asked me, why did you write a book for Christians? Aren't there enough things in Torah, in Judaism, that you can write about for Jews? Because I've always loved to write, and I always knew I'd write books. Why, people have asked me, are you writing a book for Christians? And this is the answer, because there is so much confusion and fog about what Judaism was in the first century and how Jesus sounded and what Jesus meant to first century Jews. This was one of the titles that I played around for with this book. In fact, a friend of mine wanted me to call it Jesus Lived and Died a Jew. So put it right out there, state it blankly, because a lot of people just, that's lost. And I think not only is that message enriching for Christians, not only is it a way in to understanding Jesus, the New Testament, the Gospels, but it's also, I think, a bridge that our world, as I said, the progressive left is at war with people of all faiths. And we need people of faith to have stronger ties to one another. Yeah. And instead of being a barrier, as it has historically been, perhaps the Jewishness of Jesus can be a bridge where people of faith can really unite and talk with one another. And that's how I wanted this book the way I wanted this book to serve. And it actually has served that way. I mean, the fascinating thing about this book is I've spoken about it in very conservative churches, and I've spoken about it at Unitarian churches, which many people wouldn't even consider a church. So I do think in some ways, in this divided world, if we can find some way that people of faith can emphasize where we can unite, where we can cooperate, we need that.
Take me back to that conversation and what was said and what you did about it, how it really marinated in you, how it lit a fire that grabbed a hold of you and caused you to really research, and you break some paradigms. And
this was the conversation you're referring to where the woman said, "I wish I could be born a Jew."
Yes.
Because, yeah. Oh, it was after a talk I gave. I had been invited to give a talk at this very large church here in Chicago, and it was a talk about the Jewish holidays. And it was a wonderful class, actually. It was Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. in February in Chicago. So I figured absolutely nobody's going to come to this class. But it ended up a lot of people came. And one time the class was over, I was walking out, and a woman came up to me, and we just started talking. And she was a very devout member of the church. And in fact, one of her children had married somebody Jewish as well. And so she said, "Rabbi, I study my Bible, and I've come to the conclusion that I really wish that I had been born Jewish so that I could have experienced what Jesus experienced." And I thought to myself, wow, that, there's such a deep faith. I mean, I was really just inspired in many ways by her words to think of how close she wanted to feel to Jesus, and she believed that understanding that lay in Judaism. And she said, "Well, is there more I can read? Is there more I can do?" And I thought about it, and I gave her a couple of books. At this point, I said, "Okay, I'm going to try to help," and we stayed in touch. And I looked, and I said, "What is out there to help guide this woman?" And part of it is simply reading the New Testament, because in many ways the New Testament is a Jewish book, as we talked about. But in order to understand more of the history and context, I looked, and there was a lot of scholarly books out there. There was a professor named Amy Jill Levine, who is an amazing scholar. I've read all her books. She's incredible. But it's written for other scholars. It's not written for a person who really just simply wants to deepen their faith. And I said to myself, if I really care, I've got to write this. And that's when I jumped into it. And I grew up in a fairly traditional, or in many ways, ethnic Jewish environment. Most of my friends were Jewish. I was active in the synagogue. I went to a Jewish day school. I didn't have deep connections with Christianity, but I built that over time. And I think, changed as a person as I got close to many Christian scholars and pastors who helped guided me along the way. And so It was kind of a personal journey as I wrote this book, as well as something that I just believed was so important to both deepening my new friend's faith and also building a bridge where there had only been spikes before. And it was really overall written for the person in the pew. Because as you probably know, your rabbi, Walter Jacob, he was a great giant of interfaith dialogue with major Christian pastors. But a lot of that great dialogue never entered into the pews.
No.
And so I wanted this to be a book for the pews, for people who could connect with one another and deepen their own personal faith.
One of the parallels that I saw so clearly after I began to study the New Testament was looking at Genesis 22 and seeing the binding, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, how many parallels there were to this miracle birth and to this only son concept and to the sacrifice and to the same age and to the fact that this was doing the will of the Father, and him saying that even the words of Abraham saying, my son and I are going over here to worship, when he knew full well he was going over there to sacrifice.
Right.
And so when we look at the concept of worship and sacrifice,
yes.
and how the parallels there, and they'd be back, and that they'd left two witnesses behind that didn't see what happened. I'm saying that this is, for you and I, the sacrifice of a child, we say Malach.
Right? Yeah, Moloch. Sacrifice to Moloch.
That's it. Okay? I mean, even Solomon did it. And we're shocked by it, but even Solomon did it. But as a Jew, in preparation for even the concept of a father sacrificing his son is beyond our comprehension. It's too
right.
far out there.
Right.
Yet every Rosh Hashanah,
you have to preach on it.
You have to preach on it, the binding of Isaac. And I did it for years and years and years and years. Walter Jacob, Solomon Freehoff did it. I mean, I listened to 50 different versions and perspectives on the same story, because traditionally the Akedah is preached on Erev Rosh Hashanah. And so this is something that is ingrained in you and I,
yes.
but there are parallels. There are stunning parallels to this that to the non-Jewish eye would never see.
That's right.
And never connect. So you took on the project of doing the study. What did that involve for you? And how did that feel to you? Because I'm sure you came across a lot of things that made, for instance, the terminology of the conversion of Saul. Here's the chief rabbi of Turkey, okay, who converts to, and all of a sudden, or Mr. and Mrs. Christ have a little boy named Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
Some of the things that you and I would laugh about, but this is the kind of a thought process, an underlying theme of understanding, because they just don't know that he was Yeshua ben Yosef, and what the expectations, and why didn't he meet, and did all the Jews really reject Jesus? And the answer is absolutely not.
No, or else there wouldn't be Christianity. I think a couple things that were really, I don't know if they were hard. It was just an eye-opening experience. When traditional Jews think of Christianity, I think we kind of think, oh, it's univocal. Oh, all Christians believe Jesus died in this way, said these things, had these followers. When I began to explore the literature, and not just the New Testament, but commentaries, I realized that there was as much debate and discussion within Christianity as there is within Judaism. There were all kinds of different points of view, different arguments. Just reading the Synoptic Gospels and comparing them with the Gospel of John, you see all these different differences. So I think I was exposed to a greater complexity than I knew existed. So that was good. That was healthy. That was a learning experience. I'd say the hardest part was writing about the resurrection, because I think that is probably the part where traditional Judaism and Christianity as it evolved out of that moment really differed. And I had a hard time writing about how can we understand the Jewishness of the resurrection? And ultimately, I came to a couple of conclusions. One is there is an idea of resurrection within the Old Testament. I mean, the bones, the dry bones coming to life in Ezekiel. So there is this idea of life coming out of death. And also, I kind of, just from a historical point of view, the people who believe Jesus was resurrected. Now let's just look at it purely as if you were a secular academic. Forget if it's a miracle or not. People believed that it happened, and those people were Jews. They were Jewish followers of Jesus. So of course, Judaism had an idea of resurrection within it. So that experience could be understood from a Jewish perspective, both from its biblical precedent and from the fact that people believed it happened. Whether it happened or not, that's a matter of faith. But people believed it happened, and so as Jews, and so they saw it as part of Jewish continuity. So understanding that. Also, one of the great, I think, discoveries or feelings that I came out is that the Pharisees, unfortunately, have been sort of given a bad name in history. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Partly is the rule of the Roman Empire. But, a lot of Jesus's teachings echo Pharisaic teachings. Many of the same stories. The prodigal son, there's a version of the prodigal son story in the Talmud. So trying to rehabilitate the word Pharisee has been a personal project of mine because I think they're unfairly maligned. Yes, there were strict legalistic Pharisees, but there were also Pharisees that, like Hillel, that were very similar to the teachings of Jesus. So all of that happened during that journey.
It's so interesting because when we take a look at Jewish burial, Jews are buried facing east.
Yes.
Ezekiel 43. We look at Leviticus 17:11, for the life of a thing is in the blood, therefore we don't believe in embalming.
That's
so
right.
all these things lead to the belief that when Messiah comes, that the Jews would be resurrected. So you and I technically are Pharisees. We are in the line of Pharisaical thinking in the fact that we believe in the law, the prophets, and the writings. And the Sadducees only believed in the law, not in the resurrection and not in the prophets. And I always say that's why they were sad, you see.
That's good.
Because they didn't believe in a life to come. They didn't believe that there would be a Ben David, a son of David, someone to come. And the differences, and I think one of the fundamental differences is that in traditional Judaism, there's no son of God portrayed. It is a military leader that would rise up, that would restore what would be considered to be sovereign Israel as defined by Genesis 15. And that sovereign Israel is 12 times larger than Israel is today and would be sovereign and at peace. And when we look at Ezekiel 38 and 39, we kind of get a glimpse of a land recovering from war, a land without borders, walls, and gates, a land which is at peace with its neighbors, and a land which has so much wealth that the nations would want to plunder it. Gold, silver, which we don't have, oil and gas we do. But gold and silver we don't. Those are found in outlying countries in the realm of Genesis 15 borders. So it's very fascinating to look at the fact that even all Jewish burials, the head, regardless of where the headstone is placed, the head is placed facing Jerusalem, so that when Ezekiel 43 can be translated or understood as when the Lord breaks through the eastern skies of Jerusalem, and we see the gate which was closed. He now enters through that eastern gate, the Golden Gate. We tie that to the Passover. We tie that to the last meal. That's why the gate is now closed. But we know historically, you and I have been to Israel many times, historically, of course, it's 25 feet below grade where the actual eastern gate is, and it is certainly closed. But even the boarding up, the cementing up of the upper eastern gate, or Golden Gate, is closed.
Well, I think, and that's why traditional Jews want to be buried on the Mount of Olives, as close to Jerusalem as possible, because when that day comes, that's where people will go. And so the closer you are to the old city, you can't be buried technically in the old city itself, but the closer you are, the faster you'll be part of the resurrection, essentially. And still to this day, traditional Jews want to be buried there.
And the prophet Zechariah,
Yeah,
one
right.
who foretells of a future date that says the planting of the feet on the Mount of Olives, the mountain splits in two, and then all the nations of the world will have to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, or God will withhold rain in its season from their land. So this is moving towards a more Jewish view of a millennial reign, or a reign under a Messiah who says that it's going to be the unifier, kesher, a bridge to all nations, to all people. And it says, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations.
Yes.
And great confusion. You look at the lineage to Jesus, 3 Gentile women in his lineage.
Yeah.
You have to really dissect this to understand that Rahab, Tamar, and Ruth all are non-Jewish lineage. So,
right, it's remarkable. There is a universalist. I think there's a universalist thrust to early Judaism, that the word of God shall go forth from Jerusalem. That the arrival of the Messiah is not just for Jews, it's for everybody. And I think that was part of that was part of early Christianity. I mean, Paul understood that. And I think even to this day, traditional Jews who believe that there will be a Messiah, it's a universalist aspiration. It's not just, there are different visions, right? There's one where essentially everybody becomes Jewish. But then there's also the vision of Micah, where it says, every man shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, and walk humbly with thy God. So that's a more pluralistic version. So there are different, I often like to think we're not God. We're human beings, right? There was a great medieval rabbi, Joseph Albo. He said, if I knew everything about God, I would be God, right? We don't know everything. So we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But we do know that there is a kind of global universalist message to this. And that's why this matters to everybody. We're not, as you said, it's Jews and Gentiles, as the Bible points out. There's nothing else.
And Paul writes in Ephesians 2 that from the two he shall make one new man, and this is really the unifier. The great unifier will be God. We can take a look at this concept of and I know you talk about it in the book, the Lord's Prayer. Let's just take the Lord's Prayer for example, and help break that down.
It's such a Jewish prayer. There's a whole chapter in the book about the Lord's Prayer, and this, our Father who art in heaven. First of all, our Father is a very common Jewish way of referring to God. I mean, even God says in the book of Exodus, Israel, my firstborn son. And so understanding God in familial terms, a lot of early Christian authors believed that the Our Father prayer, the Lord's Prayer, was anti-Jewish, because people would say in Judaism, God is distant. It's just our king. But the opposite is true. There was even Fiddler on the Roof, you see the way that Tevye talks with God. Tevye talks with God as family. So this idea of God is our Father. God is someone we are close to. That is deeply rooted in Judaism. And who art in heaven, God is close to us, but God is also above us. God is, the technical theological terms people say are God is immanent, God is close, and God is transcendent. There's a beautiful prayer in the Jewish prayer book. It says, God, you are as close to us as breathing, and yet farther than the farthermost star. I love that prayer because it says God is so close, but yet God is so much vaster than we can imagine. So this opening line, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Well, what's the Hebrew word for hallowed? kadosh. This is part and parcel, that something is holy, is set apart. God's name is set apart. I mean, the story about how the high priest knew God's name, and the name was lost. And we still don't know how to say the divine name, and that's why some people still, instead of saying Yahweh, say Adonai, and some people say G-D, because God's name is so powerful that we have to be very careful around it. So hallowed is God's name. Hallowed is God's reputation in the universe. Hallowed is the way we understand God. So all that is deeply rooted in Judaism. Hallowed be thy name, thy will be done. The Hebrew word for will is ratzon. And very frequently we see in Torah the word ratzon, God's will. How do we as human beings achieve God's will on earth? For traditional Jews, it's easy. It's the halakha. It's God's law. That is the enacting of God's will. Now, there are, of course, different interpretations of that, but ultimately, to do God's will is to follow the mitzvot. That God revealed his will to us in the Torah, and that's what we seek to follow. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, that's a beautiful understanding, that there is kind of like with Jacob's ladder, there's that deep connection between heaven and earth. And ultimately, there is within Judaism a understanding, I don't know if fallen is the right word, but that God's presence is not yet fully realized on earth, right? There's that great Jewish mystical teaching about the vessels, and that God, in the early days of creation, God's presence filled the whole earth. But God was so vast, there was no room for human beings. So God had to withdraw from the universe, essentially. But when God withdrew, the power was so great that these vessels shattered. And the shattering of those vessels symbolizes the imperfection of humanity. And we have to gather those vessels to bring God back into the earth. And every mitzvah that we do, every commandment we follow, is a way of bringing God back into the earth. Where were we? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. That is a fascinating, it's sort of redundant if you think about it. Give us this day our daily bread. Well, we've already said this day. Why do we need to say daily again? And so I often think that that's a reference to the double portion of manna that was given, on the sixth day to keep us through the Sabbath. And that is a reference to God's abundance. God provides all that we need. And we rely in a way on God for that. So it's a deeply, deeply Jewish prayer. I mean, there's so much there, and you could also read it. I mean, this is how some more left-leaning scholars have read it, and I don't think it's a terrible reading. But some people can also read it as an anti-Roman prayer, because our Father who art in heaven, right? Our Father, not Caesar. Our Father is not in Rome. Our Father is in heaven, right? And that we rely not on Rome for our daily bread, but we rely on our God. So the Lord's Prayer is just so rich. And, as a rabbi, I theologically have no opposition. I would have no opposition to reading the Lord's Prayer in a synagogue, because there's nothing that offends traditional Jews about the prayer. It's just, as we talked about earlier, for many Jews, Christianity was associated with anti-Semitism. So any prayer that's associated with Christianity would feel out of place in a synagogue. But from a theological, historical level, it is a very powerful Jewish prayer. And even the Kaddish, many of the same words that are used in the Lord's Prayer are in the Kaddish. Hallowed be thy name. Yitgadal, Yitkadah, Shemei Rabbah, your magnificent name. So, you and I could do a whole seminar on the Lord's Prayer and the Kaddish and how powerfully they echo each other.
Well, and what's so fabulous about the Kaddish, which has been misnamed the mourner's prayer, but it's really not a mourner's prayer, it's a prayer of hope for the coming Messiah. It's really a messianic prayer that has been applied in tradition as a mourner's prayer.
And you know why that started?
Right.
It started in after the Crusades, because it was usually used. What happened would be when a great rabbi died, his disciples would gather and they would say the Kaddish, as sort of that he was up in heaven, still existing. And then so many great rabbis were killed during the Crusades that it became a sort of annual tradition to say the Kaddish in memory of the rabbi. And then that spread and became something that was said in memory of everybody. So it became a prayer morning, even though it didn't start at all as a prayer morning.
What do you feel most Christians misunderstand about the Jewishness of Jesus? And by the way, before Y2K, Time magazine came out with predictions of the 10 things to expect in the new millennia. Number 10 was restoring the Jewishness of Jesus.
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah, go up to Time, and you'll see that this was one of the things that was going to happen in this century, in this millennia, was restoring the Jewishness of Jesus. And so that's been part of my mission, is not so much in evangelizing or having a one-dimensional ministry. It's to be a kesher, a gesher, or whichever you prefer, as a bridge to bring understanding to this, so that the richness and the fullness and understanding the parallels of the very same words and the same phrases, the same idioms. Jesus spoke idiomatically in a Hebraic idiomatic sense. Yes. He says, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. God says, as often as you celebrate the Passover, do this in remembrance. When your children ask you, why do you do this? You do this in remembrance of me delivering you. And so they're the same phrases. And he clearly says, I only say what I heard my Father say. I only do what I saw my Father do, clearly establishing that if he is the incarnate, is he the man who kol Elohim halak, the voice of God walking in the garden? Okay, we consider halak to be more two-legged. We don't attribute. I took my dog out for a halak.
Yes.
So when we see God the Creator, we see God the Spirit hovering over, the Ruach hovering over, and we hear about a walking man. We see the three approaching Abraham, and he has a meal with a human form. How do we in Judaism explain? How do we explain references to the angel of the Lord? Who do we say when we explain that Jacob wrestled because you have striven with both God and man? Not both God, both a God and a man, not two separate, but one entity, both God, because you have striven with both God and man and prevailed, then your name will no longer be Jacob, it shall be Israel. How do we reconcile that? Did God visit the earth? Okay, did God meet with Abraham in the garden, or was it strictly the voice of the Lord? I can be in the kitchen and call to you in the bedroom and not ever see you.
It's true. That's right.
And the voice of Dad goes upstairs, my voice walks up the steps and meets you in your bedroom, and you hear me say, son, come on down for dinner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Have I actually had a physical encounter?
I mean, one of the reasons I just love talking is I do think that we are in an era where the Jewishness of Jesus can help bring people together. And there's a fascinating article. Someone just sent it to me yesterday from Christianity Today. And it was talking about how there are many Christians, and there are different shades of how far they go in understanding Judaism. And I don't want to judge anybody to say what's right and what's wrong. But I am amazed by the openness, the embrace, and the resistance. A lot of the resistance, unfortunately, is coming from within the Jewish community. and that there is a kind of defensiveness. And I understand where it comes from because we are a minority people. And I see it more in my parents, and my grandparents are no longer living, but they felt the same way. But I do think that that's breaking down a little bit as we in a younger generation, that we're more open to understanding Jesus in Jewish terms, and in a kind of mutual respect that not every Christian who is interested in Judaism wants you to convert and change your religion and get baptized right then and there. And so I am really hoping that in a way Time Magazine may have been prophetic in that will really be a way of kind of overcoming these barriers that are much more historical and cultural than they are truthfully religious. And that we can truly respect and talk and work together with one another, especially now. I mean, if you look at Israel, Israel needs people of faith, people who care about Judaism, care about Israel, care about God's people to work together, because God knows that we don't have a lot of support elsewhere. So I hope, we're talking to mainly a Christian audience, obviously Christian audience interested in Judaism, but I really hope that, Jews can hear us as well and have a sense of openness and humility that really our times demand.
Well, right now we're prime time in Israel, and we're being watched. Yeah, we're being watched prime time in Israel, very deliberately. So these conversations that we have right now, it's 8:48 p.m. in Israel, and we are on prime time in the Middle East live, and then we replay throughout the time zones. But our live broadcast is watched in Israel, and I get many, many comments.
In some ways, Jews in Israel are more open to this conversation than Jews in America, and that pains me. I mean, I do think it's changing. I do think in some ways that I've gotten opposition as a rabbi, as I'm sure you experience opposition. Most of my opposition comes from people that are 70 and older.
Yes.
And that an older generation. I respect them. There's wonderful people, but I think it's a different worldview. And I'm hopeful that the American Jewish community is changing.
Yeah, I take Christians to Israel every year, and I explain to them about Tevilah. I explain to them the Jewishness of what the full water immersion.
Right, where baptism came from.
Right, where the origin of everything they believe. And so when I take them there, and even standing on the top of the Mount of Olives and saying to them, what day is this? And they say, well, it's Saturday. I said, no, today is the 10th day of the month of Nisan. Okay, this is the day of the selection of the lambs. Okay, beautiful. Now you might call it Palm Sunday, but I'm calling it what the Bible calls it, the 10th of Nisan. Now what we're going to do is we're going to compress 4 days of the 10th of Nisan to the 14th of Nisan, and I'm going to show you the parallels of the 10th to the 14th of Nisan. And as the high priest cuts the throat of the Paschal lamb, he says 3 words translated in English, it is finished. And Jesus says 3 words at the exact same moment as the same time, it is finished. Now, you make the connection, you go ahead and you make for your own conclusion, but I'm going to take you from the 10th of Nisan to the 14th of Nisan. I'm going to change your paradigm from Good Friday, because Thursday was the Passover, so you had a Shabbat. This was not a day of work, so it could not have been a Friday. It had to be, you had the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was a Shabbat. So it had to be on a particular day, which would be, and giving them the timeline of when the day begins at sundown. So he may have entered on the 10th of Nisan, but when he left after sundown, it was now the 11th of Nisan. It was the next day. Why did Paul go to the synagogue? All right, and then after synagogue, he would go into their home, because it was at the end of Shabbat. Havdalah was already, we would have celebrated Havdalah today. Okay, the sun had now set. Now it was Yom Rishon. It was the first day, after sundown, and he joined the Christians on Sunday, really Sunday evening, which was the beginning of Sunday.
How did all that get lost? I mean, I didn't answer that question in the book because I just felt, there was other stuff I wanted to focus on. But was it all Constantine? I mean, how did that depth of the story get lost? How do you explain that?
What it is, and then the seminaries take this teaching, they continue to perpetuate the teaching, and I say stop. Don't read any of your Bible through a 21st century lens. If we're talking about Abraham, it's 4,500 years ago, okay? And you have to go back in time. When you see him negotiate in Hebron, and he does it in the Middle Eastern style of negotiating, where he bows down to the sons of Heth, and he goes through this whole Middle Eastern transaction of negotiation. We'll give it to you. 400
shekels between friends? That's the price, 400 shekels.
Exactly, and we're not talking about the NIS, we're talking about 4 gerahs. We're talking about weights and measures that's talked about in Deuteronomy, and then it's applied again in the way Jesus says you're supposed to treat people. Yeah. Don't treat people differently. Don't use a different weight and measure. Don't use a different standard in how you treat people. Blessed is the one. If you take a look at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and you then go to the Sermon on the Mount, you're hearing a Cliff Notes version of the entire 613, boiled down to ones that really matter and apply, that don't have the 20% compensation for, because I killed your cow. Okay? Right. Let's get rid of those, and let's talk about Micah, justice, mercy, and how to live this good life of how we treat people. And all that's been lost, and all that's part of Jewish thought. You and I were raised to be mensches, good people, and to be good contributors to society, and to be recognized as people who were, that's a good person.
That's right.
This is what... And our witness to who the God we serve is not corrupted by our behavior. When you're behind the pulpit, you're the same Evan Moffic as you are when you're in Walmart.
Rabbi Gamliel, the inner and the outer have to match. If you wanted to be the head of a yeshiva, that was the most important qualification, aside from learning, is that your inside matches your outside. And because God is everywhere. That's one of the beautiful things about that monotheism discovered. God is everywhere. There's no public realm and private realm when you're a person of faith. In the law, the secular law, of course, there should be a difference between outer and inner. But when you're living in the presence of God, there's this great story about a Hasidic Rebbe who hired somebody to travel with him, and the person's sole job was every 2 hours to say, God is watching. That was his job, to remind us that we're always in the presence of God.
What a great message. We've been talking with Rabbi Evan Moffic, author of What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Jewishness of Jesus, a new way of seeing the most influential rabbi in history. It is a must-read for every believer to understand your identity, the foundational truths behind the very words spoken by every author of the New Testament. Okay? There's nothing new under the sun. King Solomon said it, and it is meaningful. And it's important that you understand that right now Christianity and Judaism are back to back, thinking they are an entire world apart, when all they need to do is change their perspective just a couple of degrees and find out that we're right there next to each other. And this is the message of Rabbi Evan Moffic. Understanding of who you are and whose you are will bring you closer to the one who made you. Rabbi Evan Moffic, God bless you, my friend, and all the works of your hands.
Blessings to you. So wonderful talking with you as always.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.